Hi guys, Geekonomics here, and today we will be looking at OCR F585, the global economy, and today the focus is extract 5, which is going to be the essay question, one would assume. I hope you've all done well in your AS micro paper and found the video which I did for that useful. Hopefully, as the other exams come around, you'll be able to refer to my other videos and improve your exam results by taking a look at them. So let's get straight on here with F585 essay. I think the first thing that we need to mention, if I'll just flick through here, is that the essay question at A2 is of course out of 20 marks. If you don't already know, level 3 will only take you to 10 marks out of 20. And so that means that there are 10 marks available for level 4 evaluation. And the level 4 evaluation marks are broken down, as you can see. Level 4 band 1 is 11 to 14 marks. Level 4 band 2 is 15 to 17 marks. And level 4 band 3 is the 18 to 20 marks. Now what's the difference between each of the bands? Well, band 1, there'll be relatively little discussion in a band 1 answer, and relatively little discussion and quite weak discussion at that as well, if there is any at all. For band 2, you need some good strong discussion, and for band 3, not only do you need good strong discussion, you also need to include a judgment in your answer, and we shall come on to that later. If you've read over the extract 5 material, you will know that extract 5 is, the essay question is more than likely going to be on globalization, considering some aspects of the advantages of globalization and the disadvantages. And I've mentioned this in an essay which I did previously, talking about the orthodox view and the radical view. I think regardless of what the question is, you're going to need to be au fait with the advantages and disadvantages associated with globalization and be able to include some micro and macro diagrams where appropriate. Remember, this is the synoptic unit, and so you are expected really to include microanalysis and macro. So don't be surprised if you're sitting in the exam and thinking to yourself, oh, I could include such and such diagram, but it's micro. That's perfectly acceptable. So let's have a look first at the advantages. Okay, so the advantages of globalization start with, on a very simple level, globalization creates jobs and increases the standards of living globally. Now, if you wanted to illustrate that quite simplistically really, you could of course draw your simple Keynesian aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand shifting here to the right, and we are illustrating an increase in economic growth, and comes with that of course falling unemployment, rising employment, rising incomes one would think, and hence a rising standard of living. So it'll be quite a simple way to illustrate a fairly straightforward point. Secondly, what else does globalization do? It increases trade between nations. Now, those of you who've read Stiglitz's book, you'll know that he talks in that about the trade ratios rising. So you'll all be aware of the aggregate demand equation, C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Well, the X minus M component, as a consequence of globalization, is becoming more significant within that equation. And you might also wish to refer, these points by the way are sort of very brief L2 application points. Increasing trade also manifests itself in deeper specialization, because you have more component parts coming from different countries of the globe. Okay, next one. The WTO, as you'll know, is the World Trade Organization, and part of its role is to help to facilitate globalization by encouraging the removal of trade barriers. Now that's in both developing and developed nations. And here there are a couple of diagrams which might be appropriate. So, first of all, this is the traditional tariff diagram. I'm sure you're familiar with it. So if you introduce a tariff, you're moving from PW to PW plus T. We would really want to illustrate in a discussion like this the benefits of removing such a tariff. So we'd be showing that we'd actually be moving from PW plus T, price would fall to PW. And as a consequence, the level of imports required actually goes up. And of course that is then illustrating the fact that there is more trade. You could develop that further by then considering the consumer surplus implications of that. Now, as you'll know, was a question on the AS micro paper to define consumer surplus. So consumer surplus being the area above the price, below the demand, and it's a surplus payment to the consumer which they don't actually have to pay for. If we look at this diagram, you can see that I've left off the supply curve simply because it makes it easier for your analysis, but by all means include it. The consumer surplus at PW plus T is the area A, B, C, above price, below demand. Whenever that tariff is removed, the consumer surplus is D, E, C. And so, in effect, the consumer surplus is rising here by the area B, A, D, E. So the consumer gains that area of consumer surplus. And so that's another way you might wish to sort of develop that point about the advantage of globalization and the role of the WTO. I think you could also potentially, although I haven't drawn it here, you could potentially include the quota diagram and illustrate something similar. Whenever the quota is removed, trade goes up and consumer surplus rises because price falls. Okay, let's flick back to the next advantage. Globalization also transfers technology, transfers information or knowledge, and it transfers capital. Generally, that would be a one-way street, you'd have to say, the developed nations transferring technology into the developing nations, transferring their information and know-how and knowledge and education. And obviously, one of the key things that developing nations require to develop is capital goods. And it could also, I guess, be the transfer of financial capital as well, being injected into these economies by the developed world. So there's a whole host of minor application points there. It encourages greater labour migration. If you think of China, all of the factories now situated in the big cities of China and people migrating from the little towns and villages to the big cities. Now, of course, that creates its own problems as well, but it does obviously attract labour into those areas. We've got the rise of large multinational brands. I think I put up, or certainly mentioned previously, about 10 major manufacturers now dominate pretty much everything that we consume. There's the whole aspect of increased choice, because you've got more production, more trade, therefore you've got a greater variety of choice. And of course that brings it with it its own advantages. Now you may wish to analyse that in the following way, by considering the fact that greater choice, because there are more suppliers, means that markets are becoming more competitive. And so here's your traditional monopoly perfect competition diagram, and you're showing that the reduction in price an increase in quantity is arising because of an increase in the number of suppliers. I'm sure you're all familiar with that diagram, so I'll not really explain it any further. You might also then wish to develop that one as well. Now I've forgotten to label the AR and MR curves here, but you can see a clear distinction here, which I've labeled the MC as being equal to the ATC. Now you're allowed to do that, and the reason for doing that is simply because it makes our analysis here of consumer surplus, once again, it makes that analysis a little bit easier. So if we look at the monopoly price and output, so monopolists maximizing their profits at MC equal MR, and then that leads to a price of P mon. Well, the consumer surplus at that point is the area A, B, C. Then we consider perfect competition. So at the point at which P equals MC, which is at point D, price PC, output QPC. Consumer surplus at that point is the area DEC. So if your analysis goes along the lines of the market becomes more competitive, etc., then you can be showing once again that consumers are gaining here because consumer surplus rises by the area BADE, once again. Let's get back to our advantages. Okay, and the final advantage there about reducing the number of people living in absolute poverty. I mean, predominantly growth in China has been responsible for bringing about a billion people out of absolute poverty. And remember, absolute poverty, we're talking living on less than $1 a day. So I think if you did that, we're then up to maybe the maximum point in terms of L3 analysis, because we haven't really discussed this, we've just put forward the arguments for globalization. Now let's consider the arguments against the disadvantages of globalization. So first of all, Stiglitz in his book argues that there's no trickle down. I'll not go into that, it's in my other video, but there's no trickle down. Also argues that trade liberalization has been asymmetric. So in other words, the developing nations have rushed to abandon their trade protection policies, but that has not been reciprocated in the developed world. Primarily, of course, because they're frightened of the potential threat of competition from these very low-wage, cheap labour economies. Thirdly, we talked about an advantage being the transfer of technology, of information, of capital. Well, transferring these things is all very well, but if the jobs don't exist, which they often don't, then that makes the education of the individuals in the first place rather redundant. So you've got lots of educated people, nothing to do with their skills. Right, next point, Prebisch-Singer hypothesis. If you're not familiar with the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, you need to look that up. I would certainly recommend that if you get an essay on this aspect of globalization, you must include reference to Prebisch-Singer and Harrod-Domar as an absolute minimum. But basically, Prebisch-Singer says, let me flick to it. Whoops, maybe I haven't got it here. No, not there. Right, okay. We're looking at the bottom here, the terms of trade. Basically, Prebisch-Singer says that because the traditional view of developing nations is that they produce primary products, agricultural products, well, over time, the price of those tends to fall, has a tendency to fall. And as a consequence, the price of the export from the developing nation also has a tendency to fall. And so if you then lock that into your terms of trade, again, something which you really ought to be including in an answer like this, terms of trade being index of export prices over index of import prices, or rather simply PX over PM, look at the first ratio, 10 over 1. So that means if you sell one export for £10, let's say, you could buy 10 imports. If the terms of trade declines, however, because your export prices are becoming cheaper, then you can sell 5 exports but only buy, you can sell one export but only buy 5 imports. And of course, for a developing nation, that is not a favourable movement in their terms of trade. Harrid Domar. Right, what does Harrid Domar say? Harrid Domar says that, my apologies, I don't seem to have it here. Harrid Domar says that savings leads to investment, which leads to economic growth. Well, that may well be the case, Harrid, but of course the developing nations are nations which do not have lots of spare cash to save, and therefore their ability to have the cash in the bank, to lend that money for investment purposes and then to grow is severely restricted. Next point. Some people, some authors, would argue that perhaps it would be advantageous for developing nations to try to save a little bit of money and save that money abroad. Generally speaking, they want to maybe sell their own currency and buy a stronger one, such as the US dollar. Well, let's just consider that for a moment. Here we've got, this is for, let's say, Zambia, okay? The Zambian currency is the kwacha. So we've got demand and supply here for kwacha, and then we're measuring dollar per kwacha on the vertical axis. So if Zambia wanted to purchase more US dollar, they would sell their currency, and so supply curve shifts right. Now that would lead to a depreciation of the kwacha. Now, of course, you might think to yourself, well, that's great, because export prices fall, demand should rise, ceteris paribus. Well, let's consider the impact on the terms of trade, because the impact on the terms of trade would be the one shown below, which we have just discussed. And so that sort of behaviour would further exacerbate the problem which Prebisch Singer identifies. Next disadvantage, tide aid, mentioned that in a previous video. Large multinationals acting like monopolies. Now you could, if you wanted, you can make, no need to draw this diagram again, but make reference to this diagram and say, okay, these large multinationals behave like monopolies, so they restrict output to cum on, and prices go up. And of course that is detrimental to consumers. Next set of disadvantages, trading blocks distort trade patterns. So although there may not be any trade barriers because they're all pulled down in the developing nations and the products coming out are cheap, it might actually be cheaper for the developed world still to buy within their own trading bloc, because there are no trade barriers between nations in the blocks either. Now I've got a little video and diagram to show this, and rather than me just explain it all again, I recommend that you just have a look at that. We've got the whole issue of squalor, of course, because there's the so-called race to the bottom, whereby the large multinationals, they just look for the cheapest place to locate their manufacturing plants with the weakest regulations and the weakest bargaining power in terms of labour and minimum wages and so on and so forth. And so you get a lot of environmental pollution and then environmental damage, and then you get exploitation of workers, etc. Systemic risk, again, is to do with the sort of connectedness of the world in a globalized world. And the fact that if a manufacturing plant goes down in China, then it could have a knock-on effect in the UK, because we're waiting for products to come from that particular supply chain. These economies will also lose revenue because they remove a tariff, and oftentimes a tariff is their only guaranteed source of revenue, so they're sort of shooting themselves in the foot in that respect. And then a final point, the growing inequality within nations. Lots of people would say globalization has reduced inequality globally between nations, but within nations it's actually getting worse. Now let's come back to this level 4 band 3. If you want to be in band 3, you need to include a judgment. And that judgment has to be a well argued and informed one. And I think in this case, you know, if you're going to be asked, let's say, is globalization advantageous to the developing world? Well, it's quite clear. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 advantages here, but many, many more disadvantages. So on the sort of the weight of the argument, you would have to say would be coming down on the side of, well, it's disadvantageous for the following reasons. And then you restate your points, summarize them. Anyway, I think that's it on this one. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and good luck with the AS macro next week, those of you who are doing it for the first time and those of you who are resitting. And this might be my last video, I think. I think that's me more or less done on these, so I wish you all well.